Today, we're going to talk about a story involving three missing men and the mystery surrounding the lighthouse in Flannan Island. The Flannan Isles are a group of 7 uninhabited islands off the coast of Scotland. Lore has it that these islands had some kind of mysterious power, but they were also inhabited by an evil spirit. Legend has it that if a shepherd brought his sheep to graze on the island's grass, the sheep could mysteriously heal from illness, or would be blessed with twins. However, no shepherd was brave enough to stay overnight. The largest of the 7 Flannery Islands was an island called Eilean Mor, and in 1899 there was a lighthouse built on the property. Already on the island were a couple hut-like buildings and a church. And the church has some mystery behind it because stories were told that the church would call people from the island to come pray at the church. So there are stories involving people being drawn to this church, and then before they even enter the church, they are drawn and compelled to go on their knees and to crawl around the floor praying. Those are some of the stories told about the church. In December of 1899, the lighthouse was lit for the first time, and there were 4 keepers that were assigned to work the lighthouse, and it was a work rotation of 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and there were always 3 men who were watching the lighthouse while 1 man was on their 2-week vacation, basically. In the middle of December in 1900, a year basically after the lighthouse was lit for the first time, the 4 men who were responsible for keeping watch of the lighthouse were James Ducat. He was a 43-year-old principal keeper, and he had over 20 years of experience. Donald MacArthur, who was a 40-year-old, and his title was occasional keeper. Then we had Thomas Marshall, who was the young one of the group. He was only 28 years old, and he was the second assistant keeper. And then we had Joseph Moore, who was actually not on the island at the time. He was on his 2-week break. Around midnight, December 15th, 1900, a ship passed by Flannan Island Lighthouse, and the captain of the ship, Captain Holman, says that he noticed there was no light coming from the lighthouse, even though he was close enough to see the lighthouse itself. He claims that he reported this when he got back to port. However, there's no report that this information was given to the correct place, which was the Northern Lighthouse Board. So the people who were supposed to know don't get told. On December 26th, 11 days after Captain Holman noticed there was no light from the lighthouse, the lighthouse tender ship, the Hesperus, arrived at Eilean Mor. And as the ship approached, the captain, James Harvey, found it odd that there was no flag on the flagpole. He also found it pretty odd that he didn't see any of the lighthouse keepers either. Normally, when a ship comes in to relieve some of the men, they have equipment and all kinds of stuff that needs to happen when a ship arrives. Like, they need to tie the ship off. They need to help carry stuff in and out. And remember, this is the ship that's going to bring one of them home for a 2-week vacation. So you would think that that person would be ready to go once the ship arrives. Anyway, there was no real sign of anyone on the island. So the ship decides to sound the horn 3 times, So he sounds the horn 3 times, and there's no response from the island. So the ship then decides, all right, well, if the horn's not going to work, let's send out a flare. So they send out a flare, and once again, there is no response from anyone on the island. Now, on the Hesperus was the fourth lighthouse keeper, Joseph Moore, and the captain sends Joseph Moore to go on land, and he says, hey, go check it out and see what's going on. So Joseph Moore, he goes onto the island, and he arrives at the East Landing, and he notices that there is absolutely nothing out of the ordinary at the East Landing. So he climbs up to the lighthouse, and when he gets to the lighthouse, he notices that the entrance gate, then the next door, the entrance door, and then the door after that are all closed. However, he does mention that the kitchen door was found open and that the fireplace had not been lit for several days. And even more mysterious was the fact that all of the clocks in the lighthouse were not working. All of them were stopped. That's weird. Moore also noticed that Donald MacArthur's winter coat was hanging on its hook still. And it's the middle of December in Scotland. No one goes outside without their coat. So what's that doing there? Moore then says, quote, I then entered the rooms in succession, found the beds empty, just as they left them in the early morning, end quote. So basically, Moore realizes there's something off with this situation. So he goes back to the Hesperus, and he gets a couple more men to help him do some investigating. And the men look around, and they notice that the light from the lighthouse is in complete working order, and that it's prepared to be lit. It just hasn't been lit in a long time. The Hesperus, realizing that this situation is pretty desperate, they decide to leave Moore and 3 other men on the island to run the lighthouse while they return to port to telegraph the Northern Lighthouse Board, tell them what's going on. The Northern Lighthouse Board gets an investigation underway immediately, and they send a group the very next day to find out what happened. The investigators arrived to the island, and they noticed that the East Landing was pretty perfect, but the West Landing, however, showed something much different. The West Landing showed some signs of pretty heavy damage. The first thing out of place that investigators noticed was a box that held tackle and mooring rope was gone. The box was gone, the tackle was gone, and the mooring rope was strewn about the rocks just below the lighthouse. The next thing the investigators noticed was the safety railing around the lighthouse was damaged. There were some portions that were bent, and there were portions that were completely missing. Even though this is pretty concerning, the keeper's log does mention the damage that they notice with the railing, which means the keepers went missing after this damage had already happened. And maybe most notably missing was a lifesaver that was stored 110 feet above the sea level. The ropes that were normally tied to the life preserver, they remained intact, but they mentioned they did not appear to be untied by a person, which kind of implies maybe the ocean was responsible for breaking the rope. One of the most interesting parts of this mystery is the fact that they have written records of the last few days before the lightkeepers disappear. So they have the Lightkeeper's logbook, which has some pretty detailed stuff in there. So the last full entry in the log was from December 13th. However, there were some detailed pieces of information that were included in December 14th and 15th logs as well. So on the 14th and 15th, that information was just basic information like the barometric pressure, and it actually includes the time that the light was extinguished the morning of the 15th, which was at 9 a.m. The logs, however, do not give any real information about what could have caused the disappearances. The log does report that the crew was suffering from low morale and that there had been some storms in the area that were pretty scary. The only problem with this report on the storms is no one else says that there were storms. All other reports from the people on land, everyone else from the time says there weren't any storms. So what does that mean? Are the men hallucinating? Is somebody making this information up? What's going on here? There's one more source that claims to have found additional logs, and this is contested, but we'll just explore it anyway. So these logs were said to be from 28-year-old Thomas Marshall, and he paints a picture of the last few days in the lighthouse. And he describes Ducat, who was the principal lighthouse keeper, as being unusually quiet the last few days. And he also describes the normally manly, gruff, hardened MacArthur as crying often over the last few days. He also talks about a scenario in which the storm outside was raging and the men were so terrified of the storm that they had to sit in a circle and hold hands, and they prayed for the storm to end, and they were just terrified. But the men were located in a building that was 150 feet above sea level. And the building was 1 year old. It was a brand new building, so it was in perfect condition. So the storm would have had to be massive in order for the men to be that scared. But remember, all other reports were that there was no storm, that there weren't any large, scary storms out there. So what was the logbook talking about there? Here's what we know about this mystery. There are 3 men in a lighthouse that disappear after 2 weeks of no contact with the outside world. First, we know that there is serious damage that was reported on the west side of the lighthouse, including missing equipment, damaged and missing railing. We know that the logbooks note this damage, however, which implies the men disappeared after this damage occurred. We know the logbooks talk about really bad weather, really terrifying storms, but all other information out there contradicts this logbook. We have the questionable additional logbooks that talk about the 3 men and their odd behavior. We know that the lighthouse was found prepared and in fully working condition. We know that the 3 outside doors were closed and that nothing about the interior of the lighthouse seemed off or that there was a struggle. And last, we know that there was a winter coat left hanging inside the lighthouse, which implies Donald MacArthur went outside without his winter coat on. Alright, there's a million theories out there about what took place with the 3 men at the lighthouse, and they range from a variety of the men had bad food and they had ergot, which then made them hallucinate. Maybe the men got in an argument, or maybe one of the men was depressed and killed the others. There's all kinds of these theories out there. I think probably what happened was some variation of one of the three men ended up getting into the water somehow, possibly due to the broken railing. And then the other two men panicked and went outside. I believe that's probably what happened with Donald MacArthur, and why you would go outside without a jacket on, because you're panicking and you're trying to rescue someone. And the other probably ended up, getting swept into the water trying to help the others. So it's a pretty crazy story. And unfortunately, we still do not know what happened to the three men from the lighthouse at Flannan Island. Why don't you guys tell me what you think happened in the comments? And make sure to check out what we got coming next. Scary Town Story.